Hello and welcome to the first episode of Leading the Middle Kingdom. And over the coming weeks, I'm going to take you through an abridged version of Chinese history as told through the lives of 8 emperors. Now, as I read this, China and the United States are at war and have been for over 6 years. In a study conducted in May 2024 by the Pew Research Center, over 80% of Americans have an unfavorable opinion of China, and about 50% of Americans hold a very unfavorable opinion. These figures aren't that different to Americans' opinions of Russia, at about 90% unfavorable, just over 50% very unfavorable. But for 45 years, the US was locked in a potentially apocalyptic Cold War with the USSR. No such background exists with China. According to the Chicago Institute on Global Affairs, Americans see China's territorial ambitions, its economic power, its military power, and its development as a world power as threats to the US. I'm not qualified to decide whether these opinions are justified or not, but I wonder how much the average American, or Westerner in general, actually knows about China. How many Chinese movies have they seen? How many Chinese books have they read? How many Chinese pop stars do they listen to? How many speak Mandarin? How many have visited China? Now reverse the questions, and I guarantee that the Chinese know far more about the West than Westerners know about China. Far more watch Hollywood movies, listen to Western music, speak English, and visit the West. What's the impact of that, I wonder? It's not unusual to fear the unknown, and how much do people actually know about China? That was the thinking that brought me to the idea for this podcast. I've lived in Hong Kong for over a decade and spent time working in China. Now, I'm conscious that neither of those things makes me an expert on China, but it has given me a tremendous love of the country and its people and a desire to want to know more. China as a country has existed for over 4,000 years. It's one of the oldest continuous civilizations in the world. And with history on such a grand scale, where else to look but at some of the figures who stand out from the crowd? Inevitably, that means studying the rulers of China, the emperors. Not all of them, of course. China has had over 550 emperors. That's just the significant ones that history has recorded, dating back to the Xia dynasty, which began in 2070 BCE. Compare that to 61 kings and queens of England dating back to 1066, or 47 US. That is an awful lot of history. So any attempt to study China's history by considering only a subset of its people is doomed to be somewhat superficial. But my intention here is not to provide a comprehensive history of China or a comprehensive history of its rulers. I'm not trying to explain China in some way. Instead, what I want to do is look at some of the emperors that have shaped the country through its history, for better or for worse. So I've picked 8 emperors who have left a lasting mark, who stand out to me from the crowd. Are these the best emperors to consider? Well, arguments can probably be made for an entirely different list. But these are the figures that interested me and who I thought would interest you, so these are the 8 we're going with. And that leads me, having said what my intentions aren't, to what my intentions are. And that's very simple. I'd like to share my interest with you in the hope that you will also be interested and maybe find out a little more. And in a small way, maybe we can reduce some of the ignorance of China in the West and the suspicion that can breed. In much the same way as Britain has its royal eras, the Elizabethan, the Victorian, and so on, Chinese history can be divided into dynasties, the sequences of rulers from more or less the same family. And as you can imagine, there are quite a few of them. Starting all the way back in 2070 BCE, we have, in order, the Xia, the Xiang, the Zhou, divided into the Western Zhou, the Eastern Zhou, the Spring and Autumn period, the Warring States period, the Qin, the Han, the Three Kingdoms period, the Jin dynasty, the Southern and Northern dynasties, the Sui dynasty, the Tang dynasty, the Five Dynasties and Ten Kingdoms, the Liao dynasty, the Song dynasty, the Northern Song and the Southern Song, the Western Xia dynasty, the Jin dynasty, the Yuan dynasty, the Ming dynasty, and finally, the Qing dynasty. Got all that? There'll be a test later. So, from all of those dynasties, these are the individuals who stood out to me. But before I run through them, a quick note about names. One of the more confusing things about Chinese history is the number of different names or titles one person may have at different times of their life. This gives me a bit of a problem in how to refer to these 8 individuals, and so for the sake of simplicity and to make the whole thing easier to follow, I've tried to use no more than 2 names. The name they're most well known by prior to becoming an emperor, and then their emperor name. I know that's not strictly accurate, but I'm not aiming to create a textbook or a reference guide here, so, cut me a bit of slack. I also apologize that I am probably going to butcher some names, some pronunciations, and again, I do apologize. Anyway, the 8 that we're looking at are Qin Shi Huang of the Qin, Han Wudi of the Han, Tang Taizong of the Tang, Wu Zetian of the Tang, Kublai Khan of the Jin, Dao Guang of the Qin, the Empress Dowager Cixi of the Qing, and Puyi of the Qing. From the first emperor to the last emperor, that's a span of about 2 and a bit thousand years, which should be enough for us to be getting on with. The more observant amongst you will have noticed that I kind of cheated, because one of those 8 was not technically an emperor, but all in due course. But before we launch into our study of these 8 individuals, let's take a moment to look at the state of China prior to the first emperor. The earliest Chinese societies, the Yangshao and the Longshan, emerged in the Neolithic period between 10,000 BCE and 2000 BCE. The Yangshao was the first to be identified and named, spanning the period from approximately 5000 BCE to 2900 BCE. The Longshan society dates from around 3000 BCE to 1900 BCE and eventually replaced the Yangshao. Both were largely agrarian cultures that developed around the Yellow River. The geography of China at the time was nicely delineated. The Gobi Desert to the north, the sea to the east, mountains to the west, and jungle to the south. China is characterized by vast terrains, from the fertile plains of the Yellow River to the rugged mountains in the west. Agricultural communities thrived in river valleys, the floodplains around the 2 major rivers, the Yangtze in the south and the Yellow River in the north, while nomadic tribes roamed the northern steppes. There is some evidence to suggest that the Yangshao were initially more nomadic, farming an area until the soil was exhausted before picking up and moving on, but eventually they settled down. The Longshan constructed one of the first solar observatories, which enabled them to develop an accurate solar and lunar calendar. They also seem to have kept records of this, indicating the existence of at least an early form of writing. But for reasons that aren't entirely clear, the Longshan experienced a long period of population decline, eventually forming the basis of the Xia dynasty, the first government to emerge in China and the first to adopt the policy of dynastic succession, where power was handed down from father to son. The actual existence of the Xia is debatable. Some historians suggest that the Xia were actually an invention of the later Zhou dynasty as a way of bolstering their claim to rule. When one dynasty succeeds another, usually through violent means, there needs to be some explanation of why the heavens had allowed the previous dynasty to rule, then fall, and another take its place. To address this, the Zhou created the idea of the mandate of heaven, We'll look at this in a bit more detail in a moment. The idea was that although the previous dynasty had enjoyed the mandate, it was eventually lost through immoral and corrupt behaviour. The Zhou, it's suggested, invented the Xia as a model for this. We don't need to get into it in detail, and there do certainly seem to have been a lot of mythical rulers and proto-gods in the history of the Xia, but there is also some evidence to suggest that the Xia did exist in some form. But mythical or real, the Xia were replaced by the Shang in around 1600 BCE, who ruled until about 1046 BCE. The Shang established a centralized state with a ruling elite and is primarily known to history for its advanced bronze metallurgy, writing system, and urbanization. The Xia and Shang dynasties had more localized power structures, with regional lords often holding significant authority. Governance was often based on kinship and loyalty to local rulers, and this meant that decision-making could be decentralized with feudal systems in place. The king held nominal authority, but regional conflicts between local rulers were common. Legal systems were rudimentary, with laws based on customs and traditions, and society was structured hierarchically, with the nobility at the top, followed by peasants, artisans, and then merchants. Land ownership was the key source of power and wealth, and most people were engaged in farming, cultivating rice, millet, and wheat. That being the case, agricultural practices were central to life, with seasonal festivals celebrating harvests and marking the passing of time. Once urban settlements began to grow, markets emerged in town, facilitating trades in goods such as silk, pottery and bronze tools. Barter was common, and early forms of currency began to develop during the Shang dynasty. The Shang were replaced by the Zhou in 1046 BCE, and the Zhou ruled for around 750 years. As I mentioned just now, it was the Zhou that invented the idea of the mandate of heaven to justify their position. So the way it worked was like this. The heavens selected an individual to rule on earth on their behalf. But that individual had an obligation to use this power for the good of his people. With great power comes great responsibility. If they didn't, the ruler would lose the mandate of heaven, thereby losing the right to govern, and he would be overthrown. If this is sounding to you rather like the divine right of kings, which evolved about 2,500 years later in medieval Europe, that's because it kind of is, although with some notable differences. Both are doctrines designed to legitimize the rule of monarchs, but the mandate of heaven allowed for the overthrow of corrupt rulers, and therefore, unlike the divine right of kings, was not connected to a particular family or lineage. The divine right of kings doesn't really permit questioning of or rebellion against the monarch. Essentially, rebellion against the king was rebellion against God. So if you got a terrible king, well, that was clearly God's will, and you were kind of stuck with him until he was replaced by someone else in his family, hopefully better. The mandate of heaven was more flexible and could be given and withdrawn from any family or lineage, hence the succession of dynasties over the years. During the Zhou dynasty, there were advances in technology, agriculture, and military strategies, and this period saw the first use of iron tools and crossbows, the use of cavalry, and generally more organized armies. But this period also saw the development of what became known as the 100 Schools of Thought, the emergence of various philosophical schools, including Confucianism, emphasizing morality, family loyalty, and social harmony, Taoism, advocating for naturalness, simplicity, and harmony with the Tao, and legalism, protecting strict laws and governance to maintain order. The word 100 is doing a lot of heavy listing here. There were, in fact, about 10 schools, in addition to the three I just mentioned, Confucianism, Taoism, and legalism. We also have the School of Names, the School of Diplomacy, Agriculturalism, Syncretism, Mohism, as well as some more minor schools like the School of Medicine, the School of the Military, and the Hedonist School. Why did the Zhou dynasty see such a flourishing of philosophical schools? There's some debate about this, and there's never just one reason for anything in history. It's always the confluence of many events, some of which may be small enough to have escaped history's record, so we'll never entirely know. In part, though, it may have arisen from the invention of the mandate of heaven. As a ruler's power relied on their exercise of that power in a moral way, there was a lot of debate about morality, ethics, and the correct use of power. It also meant that a lot of wannabe rulers had a vested interest in getting their case for power justified by a couple of friendly philosophers, leading to a multitude of schools of thought. Urbanization and better connection between urban centres, driven by trade, allowed these ideas to spread more easily. And this period coincided with a slow but steady loosening of the Zhou's grip, lessening the central authority and increasing the power of local rulers. The lack of a strong central authority allowed ideas to flourish and spread without fear of a crackdown from the central government, and the increasingly fractious nature of relations between the local leaders prompted thinkers to seek solutions to restore order and stability, as well as, presumably, reasons why their master should prevail and rule rather than the guy down the road. Eventually, as with all dynasties, the Zhou began to fragment. With the central government so weak, why, the local lords thought to themselves, don't I just take over? Which led to the rise of independent states within the area still nominally ruled over by the Zhou king. Eventually, 7 major states came to dominate: the Qi, the Chu, the Yan, the Han, the Zhao, the Wei, and the Qin. Frequent wars and shifting alliances between them meant that this became known as the Warring States period, for obvious reasons. This period, 475 to 221 BCE, was to become a crucial era in Chinese history, marked by significant political, social, and cultural developments. As wars so often do, the constant conflict led to significant innovations. Certainly there were military innovations, including the development of new strategies, improved weaponry, and larger armies. States began to rely on professional soldiers rather than feudal levies, which led to more organised and effective military forces. But there were also improvements in agriculture, such as the introduction of iron ploughs and irrigation techniques. This increased productivity and supported larger populations. When they weren't at war with each other, interstate trade flourished, with markets emerging in cities. This economic activity laid the groundwork for a more interconnected economy. The period saw the emergence of significant literary works, including philosophical texts and historical accounts. The Art of War by Sun Tzu, for instance, comes from this period. And most significantly, I think, the interactions between different states fostered cultural exchange, which contributed to a shared Chinese identity that transcended regional differences. So in the years leading up to the unification of China, the country was a mosaic of competing states, rich cultural traditions, and philosophical thought, all poised for transformation. When the actual warring part of this period started is a question to which there is no one answer. Depending on which source you consult, the start date was either 481 BCE, 476 BCE, 453 BCE, 441 BCE, or 403 BCE. Take your pick. I don't think the exact date really matters for our purpose. What's important to know is that whenever it started, it did, and it continued for quite a long time, maybe as long as 260 years. For those of us perhaps more familiar with Western history, you can imagine this as being similar in some ways to Europe in the Middle Ages, particularly in terms of political structure, military organisation, and cultural dynamics. Just as Europe experienced fragmentation during the Middle Ages with various kingdoms and principalities, the Warring States period saw the fragmentation of the Zhou dynasty into independent states, each with its own ruler and governance system. Both Europe and China had feudal-like systems where local lords wielded significant power. In Europe, this was characterized by vassals and lords, while in China, regional lords governed their territories under the nominal authority of the Zhou king. Similar to the rise of professional armies in medieval Europe, the Warring States period saw states developing organised and standing armies, and as I mentioned earlier, both regions experienced military advancements due to constant competition. Having so many states rubbing up against each other called for diplomacy, and just as European states formed shifting alliances and rivalries, the states in China engaged in complex diplomatic manoeuvres, often allying with each other against common foes. When diplomacy broke down, both regions saw wars as a means of expanding territory and influence. The constant warfare in the Warring States period is comparable to the frequent conflicts in Europe, such as the 100 Years' War. Of course, there are significant differences in context, culture, and historical development, but the comparison between the 7 major states of the warring period and European states is valid. Both periods illustrate how political fragmentation can lead to military innovation, cultural flourishing, and the eventual emergence of unified states. Qin was the westernmost of the 7 warring states, which meant that it had some significant advantages over the others. It didn't have any states to the west, south, or north, which meant that it could focus on one front, unlike, for instance, the state of Han, which found itself surrounded on all sides. On the other hand, being out on the edge of the conflict also meant that Qin's initial influence was limited, and the inhabitants of Qin were actually seen by the other states as rather barbaric. During the early part of the Warring States period, Qin's location allowed it to avoid getting involved in conflicts, preferring instead to perhaps allow the other states to sort things out amongst themselves. This lasted until around 356 BCE, when the ruler of Qin at the time, Duke Xiao, and his prime minister Shan Yang began to make changes to the operation of government in line with the philosophies expounded in the school of legalism. What this meant in real terms was that Qin became a more centralised and authoritarian state. Land was privatised, farmers who exceeded quotas were rewarded, farmers who didn't meet quotas were enslaved and given, along with their lands, to the successful farmers. As Qin peasants were recruited into the military, Shang encouraged immigration of peasants from the other states as a replacement workforce, which had 2 benefits: increasing the Qin population while reducing the manpower of the other states. All of this had the effect of making the state of Qin disproportionately powerful when compared to the other states, something those 6 states began to wake up to, realizing the danger that lay to the west. Putting aside their differences, the policies of these 6 weaker states became increasingly orientated towards together dealing with the threat that the Qin now posed. Sadly for them, however, it was too late, and the state of Qin remorselessly began to conquer them one by one. First of all, in 230 BCE was the tiny state of Han, which shared its westernmost border with the Qin. Han was by far the weakest of the states, and its leader at the time bowed to the inevitable and surrendered early, recognizing that this would be better than a long, destructive and ultimately futile defense. The remains of the Zhao kingdom followed 2 years later, in 228, and the state of Wei was next in the Qin's sights 3 years later, in 225 BCE. The Qin army invaded Wei and headed straight for its capital, Daliang, only to find that its defences were too strong. Instead of a direct assault, the army diverted a nearby river and flooded the city. The devastation created caused the leader of the Wei, King Jia, to come to the same conclusion as the king of Han, and the Wei in turn surrendered to the state of Qin. So far so good for the Qin, and they turned their attention to the state of Chu, one of the more powerful of the warring states. The Qin army had already begun a process of weakening the state by capturing its western territories in earlier campaigns, including the capture of the Chu capitals Ying and Chen in 278 BCE. The final attack on the Chu was launched in 224 BCE, and despite initial setbacks, the Qin strategy of attrition and careful planning paid off, avoiding direct confrontation until the Chu forces were sufficiently weakened. At Sochun, in modern-day Anhui province, the Qin forces managed to encircle and defeat the Chu army, leading to the capture of the Chu king and the fall of the state in 223 BCE. These battles must have been terrifying. At their peak, the combined armies of Chu and Qin are estimated to have ranged from hundreds of thousands to 1 million soldiers. The following year, Yan fell to the Qin army. Watching what had happened to the other states and realizing the danger and gravity of his situation, Crown Prince Dan of Yan had tried to have the king of Qin assassinated. Unsuccessfully. This backfired somewhat, as, quite understandably, it only made the king of Qin even angrier and more determined. The Qin had already captured Yan's capital, Ji, modern-day Beijing, in 228 BCE, and there was little to stop them from finishing the job in 222 BCE. Now, if you've been counting, and I know you haven't, you'll know that only left one state to oppose the Qin, the Qi. Now, the Qi had tried to maintain strict neutrality throughout this period, refusing to get involved in the struggles of the other states, believing that this would spare them the same fate. As soon as Qin's intention to invade it became clear, Qi swiftly surrendered all its cities, completing the unification of China and ushering in the Qin dynasty on a somewhat anticlimactic note. The Qin king, Yin Zhen, declared himself as Qin Shi Huangdi, the first sovereign emperor of Qin. In the rule of the Qin state, the union was based solely on military power. The feudal holdings were abolished and noble families were forced to live in the capital city, Xianyang, in order to be supervised. A national road, as well as greater use of canals, was used in order for deployment and supply of the army to be done with ease and speed. Peasants were given a wider range of rights in regards to land, although they were still subject to taxation, creating a large amount of revenue to the state. This centralized bureaucratic state established by the Qin would influence subsequent dynasties. We'll leave it there for now. Join me next time and we'll look at the story of the man who put an end to the Warring States period and went down in history as the first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huang.